Welcome, everyone. My name, if you don't know me, is Rabbi Marc Katz, and I want to introduce Ann Phillips. And if you want to say just a word about yourself.
Sure. I have majored in art history in college. I have most of a master's in art history and have spent my career in the gallery world, primarily being a gallerist and an art advisor. So my primary field of expertise is 19th and 20th century art, but we're going to go way backwards in art history a little bit here to talk about the story of Jonah.
Exactly. So we figured rather than just read the story of Jonah and tell you what happens, we would use art as Midrash to best understand it. Now, what is Midrash? Midrash is an ancient technique that our rabbis used to use to kind of expand the world of the story. So you would find characters. In this case, in Jonah's story, you've got Jonah, you've got God, you've got the king of Nineveh. And so what do? They tell extra stories to better kind of understand who these people were, what they were doing. You can almost think of it like ancient fan fiction. Now, art functions in the same way, and we're going to look at art as a way to kind of understand how these different artists expanded the world of the story itself. Now, before we begin, we have to understand what the story is. So if you know the book of Jonah, God appears to Jonah and he says, look, take a trip to Nineveh and go tell the inhabitants there that very soon I'm going to destroy their city because they are very wicked. Now, Jonah is worried. He doesn't want to listen to God. He doesn't want to follow through. And I'm sure we could talk about many reasons why that is, but he runs and he hops on a boat headed toward Tarshish, which is in the complete opposite direction. Now, God catches wind of this and realizes that Jonah's trying to flee. And one of the big messages from the book of Jonah is you can't outrun God. And so Jonah ends up in a storm. The ship is about to sink. He realizes it's his fault, and he asks everyone to throw him overboard. And after they do, and this is the most famous scene from the book of Jonah, Jonah gets swallowed up by a giant fish, a dag gadol. And he sits in the belly of that fish for 3 days. He becomes penitent. There's a beautiful poem about how Jonah kind of learns that he's doing the wrong thing and asks God if God will let him go, until finally God does. The fish vomits him out onto land. He walks to Nineveh, goes to the king and tells the king, you need to change your ways. Now the king, and a surprise in the story, listens to Jonah. He immediately puts on sackcloth and ashes, sits on the ground, and says to all of his inhabitants, including the animals, that they need to do the same. Now, Jonah finds himself outside the gates, and he's disappointed that he walked all the way to Nineveh only to have Nineveh not be destroyed. He wanted the laser light shows. He wanted the walls to come crumbling down. And so Jonah is sitting there, and God, realizing that God needs to change Jonah's mind and teach him a lesson, ends up creating a gourd to give Jonah shade as he sits waiting for the city to be destroyed. Now, eventually, God sends a bug, really a worm, to eat the gourd, and the gourd withers. And Jonah looks at God and basically says, end me now. I can't take sitting in this heat waiting for the city to be destroyed. And God ends with a question. It's the only book that ends with a question in the whole of the Bible. God says basically, did you expect me not to care about my inhabitants? You care about a little gourd. How am I not supposed to care about the people of Nineveh and all their animals? And that is ultimately how the story ends. So now that we hear this story, what we're going to do is we're going to look at a few different pieces of art that each tell one scene in their own way. And that scene is going to be Jonah being vomited up on land by the fish, as a way to kind of understand the way that these different artists understood the character of Jonah, who the fish was, who God was in all of this. And we'll end with one surprise at the very end for all of those who love Amsterdam. So we'll move into, I'll share my screen now with everybody, and Ann and I will be in conversation about each of these different pieces. So hopefully people at this point can see my shared screen. And what are we looking at here?
Okay, I've lost my notes, but that's okay. I think I can do it off the top of my head. What we have here is labeled the sarcophagus of Jonah from the Roman period. This is a sarcophagus. It's in the Vatican Museum, and it's one of the most famous images of Jonah. Of course, sarcophagi were, important artistically in the Roman era too, but now here in this early Christian era, we see the beginnings of what will really be the theme for a lot of Western art to come for centuries. And that is that if you can imagine living in the time when Jesus was alive and in the years after, the Christian religion was trying to figure out a way to gain new, followers and to tell the stories that they needed to tell to these, to the new adherents of the religion. And so this was a time when people were illiterate, nobody could read, there weren't books. So they did this through art. So a lot of the early Christian art is really fascinating because you see them developing their kind of marketing of the religion to the people in the world at that time, and how they're using these images in the early churches or in the sarcophagi like this to really tell the stories. And one of the themes that is predominant throughout is that the Old Testament prefigures the New Testament. So they're always matching up a scene from the Old Testament to something in the New Testament and saying, see, this isn't really just about Jonah. This is really about something else that has to do with Jesus or the Christian religion. So in the case of Jonah, the fact that he is thrown into the water, is in the belly of this creature for 3 days, and then emerges onto dry land, becomes a prefiguration of the resurrection of Christ, because Jesus was in the tomb for 3 days before he emerges and is resurrected. So and it's also a reference to baptism. So everything I've learned about Christianity, I've learned through art, through studying art history through the ages. And so Jonah is usually depicted naked, being thrown into the sea so it can connect more strongly to the idea of baptism. And the way that the creature is depicted, it's not always, it's a little ambiguous in the Hebrew, but then it gets translated into Greek in some Bibles, and then Rabbi knows way more about this than I do, and then into other languages. So I think that this creature, which looks much more like a serpent, is really derived from the word that was used to translate the Hebrew into Greek, which had more of a meaning of serpent rather than fish. So that's why sometimes this, the idea of the whale is really a much later nomenclature for the creature in the sea. But at any rate, and like many of these carved reliefs, there are many different scenes. So they're really trying to tell the whole story throughout. So you see, obviously the ship, and him being, thrown into the sea, and then he's spit out onto the dry land, and above that is him reclining like a sort of Greek figure under the gourd. And then above in between those two scenes, there's this little tiny figure, and that's actually Moses, who's receiving the olive branch from the dove. So there's another reference there. And then in the far upper left, they bring in the resurrection itself, and that's Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus, I think. So anyway, there's a lot to unpack here, but we have more to go.
One of the things that I like about this is the fact that, first of all, the serpent is a really important image in Judaism in general, right? If you think about it, the original fall, right? Adam and Eve, it's the serpent that convinces them to do this. The serpent at the bidding of God or not at the bidding of God. It's a big question, right? The other thing, and you pointed this out when we were prepping for this talk, is that on the right-hand side, you see a father and a son who are kind of observing. And so one question that I never even considered is, look, this is a miracle, right? Jonah ends up in the belly of a whale or fish, or in this case, a serpent, gets spit out onto dry land. But the question is, did anybody see it? And so this is an interesting question that gets raised by the sarcophagus and answered in the sense that there are witnesses to this. Right. And I think in a Christian milieu, it makes sense that you don't want miracles to happen in a vacuum, right. But rather, there are witnesses. There are witnesses to the resurrection. People who show up later see the empty the empty cave, people in the book of Acts who get a chance to, to hear from Jesus directly, the Holy Spirit. And so every other image that we're going to look at does not have witnesses. And I think that's really important here. Let's turn to the next one. And you
I
can
just want to say a little bit, one little thing, like the witnessing, there are all those images of people pointing to the various, like the saints, and they're, where they're injured or where they, how they were killed, or they're pointing to the, injuries in Christ's body. So there's that whole idea of witnessing is very important in the art too.
Awesome. So what are we looking at here?
This is Tintoretto, who studied with Titian. He's obviously an Italian artist, one of the most important artists, Venetian artists. And this is from the Scuola Grande di San Rocco, as it says. They were these various scuole in Venice, which were confraternities of middle-class people who got together, sort of like mutual aid societies. And it was a way for the middle class to try and do good for their community and also gain some stature and prestige in the Venice community. And so what you have to understand was this is part of a whole architecture, sort of like the Sistine ceiling. Some people think that this was one of the most famous ones, is kind of the Venetian equivalent of the Sistine ceiling in Rome. So the shape of this would have been surrounded by architecture of all these grand rooms. And so Tintoretto did this whole painting cycle in several of the different rooms in the Scuola, and including one that had a lot of scenes of the Old Testament and the New Testament. So obviously here we have, well, the Rabbi and I are discussing this, whether who's Jonah here. I actually think the central figure there is Jonah, because he's, as I said, it was important that he be shown naked to have this connection to baptism and rebirth. And in lots of other images, he's shown naked with just this sort of drapery, for modesty, and shown with the white hair and a beard, although he does appear very godlike too. But then that begs the question, who's the figure on the left? That's the witness, maybe. I don't know. who that could be, but the creature is very hard to really ascertain there. It doesn't look like a whale or even like a sea creature, but there's some references to the creature being a fish with a dog face, and I think that's kind of what we have here, with almost like a nose and this kind of big stream of air coming out of the creature's nose as he spits Jonah onto the dry land.
And as I've read about this, when we were talking about this, one of the things that many people think is that there are two creatures, and one is God and one is Jonah. And so we had a little bit of a disagreement about who was God and who was Jonah when we were originally trying to understand this, because we couldn't find any unanimity online about that. But if the center creature or the center person is God, hypothetically, because it does look like a kind of a God that you would find on the Sistine Chapel, and the left-hand side is Jonah, or the opposite. What's important nonetheless is the fact that Tintoretto imagines that Jonah is having a conversation with God.
Right.
The conversation in the belly of the beast, right? That middle chapter in the book of Jonah, he's pouring out his heart to God, but it's not like God ever responds. He finishes pouring out his heart to God when he's in the belly of the fish, and then the fish spits him out, and then he continues. Here you get to see an actual conversation. Mm-hmm. God is the ultimate witness and the ultimate teacher in that moment as well. Mm-hmm. So do you have any last minute stuff to say before we move on to the next one?
No, I think that's it.
So what are we looking at now?
Okay, here we're moving to Northern Europe. This is Jan Bruegel the Elder, sort of Dutch artist, Flemish artist. And he's very much painting in the Dutch style. He was known for painting in many different genres. He did still lifes, he did these kind of fantastical images of paradise, he did landscapes and seascapes. And part of the Counter-Reformation, which was very important in the Netherlands, was the feeling that you could worship God by worshiping everything that he created in the world, all of God's creation. So the Northern Renaissance artists had much more of an interest in painting landscapes and, all sorts of, scenes of daily life. Everything was important, rather than the Italian artists. And so here you get this whole seascape, this whole little context for the moment when Jonah is kind of spat out onto the dry land. And again, the creature's looking more like a fish here, which is kind of interesting. And then you can see in the lower left, there's what looks like a large snail of some sort. And all the Dutch or Northern artists, everything was very complicated iconography. Everything had a meaning. So I'm sure there's some meaning, which I don't know, for why he decided to put that snail there. It's not just a random thing. The snail must have had some sort of significance, which was telling. But as we were talking before, there's this beautiful light coming in from the left where you see the kind of the white caps. And to me, that's part of maybe that's the conversation with God there, only it's done through light rather than having the two figures together.
The other thing that I want to point out, and I want you to notice as you're looking at this for those who are watching, is kind of what state is Jonah in, right? We're told that the fish vomits him onto dry land. Here he's walking very kind of penitently, as Anne said. The other thing is the state of the fish, right? It almost looks like the fish has just been through an ordeal, like the fish has been worn down. He's so exhausted that he opens his mouth and allows Jonah to walk out. So I want you to really pay attention to the state of Jonah and the state of the fish as we look at the next two, because this functions as a midrash in trying to explain who these different characters are. I will also say, pay attention to his age. In the sarcophagus, he looked like he was slightly older than me. Right here, he looks like an old man, just like he looked like an old man in the next, in the previous. But take a look at this next one. Totally different, right? So
Very
what do we see here?
And this is Peter Lastman, who was actually one of the teachers of Rembrandt. And he had spent a lot of time in Italy. And so this very much resembles, what an Italian artist would have done with this scene, in that the figure's very muscular. It's a very dramatic, rendition of the scene, because you're up close, you're right there, as opposed to the Bruegel where you see the whole landscape, the whole sea in front of you. Here, you're just like, you're standing there on that rock, and he's just bursting out onto the picture plane right in front of you. So, and again, it's a very detailed sea creature, really kind of fantastical looking creature. And this is what I mean, like the Tintoretto, we were discussing who was God and who was Jonah. He was very much like that figure there in the center of the Tintoretto, where he's got the long beard, just the cloth around him, and he's otherwise naked. But he looks, sort of surprised and relieved, that, oh my gosh, I'm finally out of there. And with this great force of the wind coming from the sea creature. So it's a beautifully rendered work, and probably one of the most famous images of Jonah and the whale.
Yeah. I mean, one has to ask the question about whether or not Jonah knew he was going to leave when he did, right? The fish vomits him onto land. Does he know in that moment he's going? Has he heard a voice that says, Jonah, get ready to go? Here, it doesn't look like he did. Whereas
I don't think so.
it really does look like he's ready to go. He's thankful. And the question is, does he realize that he's now been spit out onto land within a reasonable walk away from Nineveh, and that he's going to be going and doing that? So we move to the next one, and this is our last in the kind of Jonah onto land sequence. And what are we looking at, Anne?
Well, this is much later in time. So this is right around 1900. And it's a very interesting story. It's James Tiso, who's a French artist, who is known throughout his career, is very famous for society portraits. He did beautiful women, and with all, great detail to their dress and all the, their hats and their parasols and all the different fabrics of the dresses. People at cafes, they were very sort of frothy pictures of well-to-do people. And at a certain point, he's in the Church of Saint-Sulpice in Paris, and he has a a religious conversion. He sees this vision. And from then on to the end of his life, he only paints religious scenes. So this is, did not even know about this side of Tiso's work. I was astonished to see this. So he embarks on these big projects to illustrate first the New Testament and then the Old Testament. And interesting enough, through the Schiff family, a famous New York Jewish family, all of the watercolors for the Old Testament were purchased by the Schiffs and given to the Jewish Museum. So this is in the collection here in New York. But here, this being 1900, now the figure of the man, or Jonah, is predominant. And so you have, much less of, you have this sort of sense of that he's, coming out of the sea, and you have the end of, the tail end of the sea creature, but he's really walking onto the shore himself. And it's really he's taking up the whole picture space. So now the individual has become the most important thing, which is a very much a 20th century concept. And he's looking almost disdainfully over his shoulder at the whale. So I think he's certainly striding fully within his power onto the shore.
And you're bringing up a really interesting point, which is like the question of, where should the emphasis lie in a story, right? I'm sure we've all read literature where the setting is the main character, or the character or the protagonist plays a huge role versus a protagonist who plays, let's say, a subservient role to the events of the story, right? The plot. And so by choosing whether to paint Jonah large, paint Jonah small, paint the landscape large, paint the landscape small, these artists are making conscious choices about like kind of what is the timbre or feel of the story, in the same way that we would when we read a great piece of literature. I also noticed that he kind of, as opposed to our last one where he looked surprised, right? Or the one before where he looks penitent. If you move forward, here he kind of looks disgusted. Like he knows that he needs to go to Nineveh, and he's really annoyed about that. And you get that sense. I also like the fact that he's probably around 34 years old, which not only around my age, but also Jesus' age too, which I think like all the more so proves the point that you made at the beginning.
And no beard,
connection.
So very different kind of look.
So we've now kind of looked at this cycle of different people coming out of Jonah. I want to leave us with one final image. Because our congregation is so connected to Amsterdam, we might as well finish with a Rembrandt. And so this is right? Rembrandt paints Jonah, an old man, notice, as opposed to younger, sitting underneath his gourd, kind of waiting for the city to be destroyed and upset that it won't, right? But I'm curious if you've got anything final to add about this image before we end today.
Only in that Rembrandt, of course, was just one of the most extraordinary artists who ever lived. But he was always, what was so extraordinary about him, not only his facility with painting, but his ability to paint the psychology of his sitters or the people in scenes such as this. So even in this little ink sketch, a preparatory work for something, or maybe an idea he was working on, you get so much of the emotion and whatever the feelings that were going through Jonah at the time. So I think it's, so typical of Rembrandt that even in this little scrap of a thing, there's so much going on there psychologically. But I have a question about Jonah, having spent so much time looking at these images and reading the book of Jonah, which is, why did God choose such an imperfect messenger?
Interesting. Good question. I mean,
like, why him? He could have chosen somebody else who was, I'll go, and I'll go right to Nineveh, and I won't fool around going to Tarshish instead.
I mean, so that's the essence of the story, and that's what makes biblical stories so interesting. Is that like our heroes are usually anti-heroes, and in this particular case, like this is an anti-prophet. It's the difference between Greek literature and Jewish literature. Greek literature tends to be, the forces of the gods and one inner flaw causing people's downfall, versus people's downfall actually being the thing that makes them interesting, and that that makes it work. So the answer is no one knows. That's what makes the story so amazing.
Mhm.
I've always thought that part of the reason that God came to Jonah is because he wanted someone who was reluctant to go.
Mhm.
Because right, the medium is the message in this particular case. And if somebody were to go and they were to be, excited about their task versus someone who's worried about their task, doesn't want to do it, is apprehensive, it's going to read differently to the people of Nineveh. I wonder if a different prophet went to Nineveh, if Nineveh would have reacted with the kind of gusto of repentance that they did when they met Jonah.
Interesting.
So with that being said, Anne, I want to thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure.
For all
So
those
fun.
who joined us, I hope you have a good rest of the afternoon.
Thank
Our
you.
Ne'ilah services begin at 6 p.m. You can find the link for that in your emails or online. And please be in touch if you have any insights about any of this art or even the last question that Anne asked. So thank you very much.
Thank
And
you.
Mar Chatima Tova to everyone. May you have a meaningful end of your fast.
All right. Same. Thank you.